I shall start with two apologies. One is for my accent. It tends to drift in and out of Southern English and Canadian. I apologize for that. And also, I don't wear shoes. You might notice I like to feel comfortable in my classroom. My students, the only thing they write in their evaluations, I should wear shoes. One of those things you deal with. This is a real honor for me. A real honor. It's I've known Dave's work for years. It was influential in my PhD. It was influential writing my book. I've read half a dozen at least of Dave's papers, and so this week's a week of first really for me. Despite having read loads of Dave's work, we've never actually had a chance to meet in person. So on Monday, I actually met Dave for the first time. And the interesting story behind me coming here for this talk was that I'd read probably the sixth paper of his, and I thought, bloody hell, like, this is another paper that's just so good and so relevant to my work. I'm just going to send him an email and say, Nate, we should meet up sometime and go for a beer. And the next thing I know, I get a reply, and he says, do you fancy coming over to do a keynote speech at the conference in England? I was like, brilliant. Yeah, all right. Well, that sounds awesome. So I'm really pleased to be invited. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And also great to meet Simon as well. We've got some really good collaborations going, and hopefully this will turn into a long-term sort of collaboration. So I'm really pleased to be here. It's also the first time that I've had the title of my talk decided for me, which is quite funny. After Dave and I had a discussion about my talk, I said, well, I can really talk about anything you like. He says, well, talk about the broad sort of social history of tennis, but if you can make it relevant to the Northwest, that would be really good. And so I was like, yeah, okay, I'll come up with a title and come up with an abstract and send it to you. The next thing I know, I get the conference sort of form, the I guess the schedule through, and lo and behold, a title's been chosen for me. So the subject of my talk apparently is social history of tennis in the Northwest, and I thought I'd find a nice quote. It's also the first time I've been to Crewe, which is relevant for me because I was looking for inspiration for this talk, and so I turned to, some of you might know this one, Pies and Prejudice. Anyone heard of this book? Stuart McConey? Yes. Brilliant book. I read it about 5 or 6 years ago. Pies and Prejudice in Search of the North. And I thought, I wonder if he says anything about Crewe, because I'd forgotten. And so I opened it up and read the first couple of chapters, and I'll read it to you. And he's basically trying to find where the North starts, a very short paragraph. Go a little further north, and you reach the spot where I would say the North undeniably begins. Though it's in a very classy and grand county, it's far from classy and grand. It's an iconic structure, though it isn't architecturally impressive or visually striking. For homecoming Northerners, it is the first sign that they are back in the right place, their moral and cultural compass righted. For Southrons heading up country, it is here that the realization begins that you may be in a foreign country. As the vowels flatten and the skies grow leaden and the track curves away from you to the hills and moors and chimneys of the north. Welcome to Crewe Station. Please make sure you have all your belongings with you before leaving the train. And so, when looking at what I was going to talk to today, I thought, well, I'll talk obviously about tennis in the Northwest, but I'm going to broaden it more generally. And apparently this is a seminar, it says on the poster, so I'm going to give you some aims, like you would in a lecture. I'm going to introduce some key facets of lawn tennis as an amateur sport in Victorian Edwardian Britain, highlight some nuances in the historical development of tennis in the Northwest. And really what I want to do is sort of put that in the broader context of the North-South divide and really question whether there actually is a North-South divide in tennis, because we know that it exists perhaps in other sports, or there's certainly a perception. So we're going to look at coaching, competition, talent development, amateurism, accessibility, etc. And look broadly at an overall critical account of the development of tennis in Britain. That focused mainly before the First World War, but also going on to look at some periods shortly after that and into the post-war period. So some context, really, for this talk. So despite early lawn tennis not being played in the public schools, really until the interwar period, it was always imbued with similar amateur ideals. And this is because a lot of the people who went to public schools ended up being the chairmen, the chairs of clubs, and playing the sport, even if they weren't sort of playing the sport from public schools themselves. The same amateur ideals remained. So gentlemanly conduct and chivalry in the sense particularly when men played with women and ladies and gentlemen played together. We'll talk about that in a second. But for this idea of gentlemanly conduct really was also a class construction in terms of how men should behave around other men, and the ways in which they played reflected actually their status as gentlemen, as upper middle class gentlemen. Also the sense of social exclusivity. Clubs weren't available to all. They were only for a particular portion of the population. And you had to be somebody and know somebody to get in. So really, tennis is positioned very early on as an aspirational sport, the sport that particularly the middle and the lower middle classes wanted to play, because by simply being a member of a club and being a member of an exclusive club, it was a symbol of status. It's a bit like driving around in a Range Rover today. And this was not only sort of something that occurred organically, but also something that was constructed by the game's alleged inventor. And I say alleged because he didn't invent lawn tennis. Lawn tennis was a sort of amalgamation of a various number of sports played in an outdoor lawn tennis court. But Major Walter Clopton Wingfield is usually credited with creating the first box set. He called it Spheristique, Sticky for short. And he actually marketed his game. When he created the fifth edition of his rules, he actually preempted that by actually publishing a list of all the members of royalty and aristocracy who had purchased a box set. So he marketed his game as having a large aristocratic following, and it became popular as a form of conspicuous consumption. And of course, who wouldn't want to play a game that members of the royal family or members of the aristocracy play? Now, this aristocratic following died down around the 1890s, but some of the attitudes towards amateurs and the play itself remained. So we have early class exclusivity. Now, I mentioned that players really saw their participation, saw their membership of a club as an avenue towards social advancement. Really, it was a means to climb the social ladder, so to speak. And this was the case not only with men sort of vying for positions in the workforce, but also with women. And you know, if you were to type into Google image Victorian mixed doubles tennis, you have loads of lovely images like this one here, where you have ladies and gentlemen. Some of them are quite young, engaged in tennis on the court, or in this case, off it, looking very relaxed, having a great time. Now, tennis was really the first sport where men and women not only played together in the same clubs, but also actually played together on the same courts, and the same playing field. And this is significant because obviously it gave women a chance for physical emancipation, but also really, thinking about the tennis club generally, and this is in the North and the South, you know, tennis played a role in essentially providing men the chance to flirt, which all men like to do if they're young. So, you know, this idea of courtship was obviously very closely tied up with the popularity of tennis among this class. We also have this idea of playing styles and etiquette being a reflection of class, and really this idea of self-restraint was key. This is what underpinned the gentlemanly ethos at its time. So, gentlemanly behavior was reflected in the way players actually played against each other. So, and this is a subject outside the scope of this paper, but you know, in the very early development of playing strokes, for example, the first lawn tennis players, most of them came for either rackets or real tennis. Now, if you know of either of those sports, the skill of rackets and real tennis is, and success is determined by essentially your ability to cut and slice. Lots of cut, lots of slice. And in real tennis, if you cut and slice, the ball would hit the back wall and drop and make it very hard to return. Very different now, of course, where topspin means it's more successful. But a lot of the early plays in the first 2 or 3 years all came from those two sports. And so the player who volleyed, of course, hit the ball before it bounced, was seen as unsporting. Because how dare that individual do that? I've put all this effort into my slice, and he's just volleyed it away. And so the early volleyers were actually disrespected and considered to be ungentlemanly. And then, of course, you had the ungentlemanly player who decided to try and beat the volley by hitting lobs. And then, of course, it was like, well, is it appropriate to lob when the player is facing the sun? And then those who decided to beat the lob by hitting an overhead smash, which, of course, is the most natural way of defeating a lob, were also considered to be ungentlemanly, because the overhead smash is usually a fairly aggressive shot. And so, again, this idea of restrained behavior in sportsmanship is always tied into ideas about class and who played lawn tennis at this time. Clubs, interestingly, also, unsurprisingly, considered it a means for themselves to, members are very keen to make sure that they were playing in a club that was prestigious. So there's also this sort of almost hidden competition between clubs to recruit the best players. I'm not talking about best in terms of performance, but best in terms of status. And so you'd have these incidences where clubs would only perhaps play against other clubs of the same social status. So hosting tournaments. This is actually Fitzwilliam Club. This is an image taken around the 1880s, 1890s. I actually visited Dublin. I was at a conference, sports sociology conference in Europe, in Dublin in June. And I didn't stand this position because this is fairly high up, but I stood at this kind of angle. And I was able to figure out exactly where this was taken. Interestingly, not only are the buildings still exactly the same, but this little hut here is still there. And it's 120 years later. It's amazing. It's now a private garden. You actually can't get in, but I jumped the fence. That's how I roll. But hosting tournaments was a way for cities and clubs to basically put on a show and to impress local dignitaries and impress within that sort of within the high society. Also, another way of achieving certain status was engaging elite patrons. So the aristocracy continued to play a role in tennis, and they still do, of course. You know, the members of the royal family still patronize Wimbledon, but having an elite patron was again a sign of status. Also, at this time, so were organizing inter-club matches. And I have a very interesting anecdote. You know when you do archival research, and every now and again you just come across an absolute gem. And this is a quote I found. It is absolutely it was a home run when I saw it. I thought I can't not include it in my book. But basically, the sense is here that clubs only chose to play with other clubs that were of a similar social status to them. And if you played with a club that was seen as a lower status, that was obviously not something you want to be publicly doing. So I'm going to have a sip of water before I read this quote. And this is from 1889. In an old-fashioned Kentish town, there are two lawn tennis clubs, the one noted for its exclusiveness, and the other numbering among its members many of the local tradesmen and their assistants. A neighbouring club, also of the genteel kind, had intended to invite the exclusives to a friendly match. But by some mischance, the challenge was delivered to the town club. And they, feeling highly flattered, of course, hastily accepted. The appointed day arrived, and the visitors, arrayed in bright blazers and smart gowns, journeyed to the grounds of the aristocratic ones, where they were delighted to find a champagne luncheon with strawberries and cream and other seasonal dainties in lavish profusion, awaiting their arrival. The hosts advanced to meet their visitors, but soon became aware of the mistake which had been made. The champagne luncheon, strawberries and cream, and other delicacies were hurriedly removed. Neither hosts nor visitors partaking of them, and a general coolness pervaded the scene. What was to be done? The home club had challenged the others, and the match must be played, so played it was. The full scores have not come to hand, but we are credibly informed that the lady milliners and dames de comptoir proved themselves much too good for the aristocratic ladies, but the gentlemen, nerving themselves for great efforts, avenged their fair friends' reverses by defeating the townsmen handsomely, thus winning the match by the odd event. It was felt that some refreshment must be offered the visitors who, instead of tasting the champagne, etc., were hospitably regaled on beer and bread and cheese. I just love that. It's an absolute gem. So you get a sense that these interclub matches really were a reflection of class and power struggles within clubs as a way. Now, of course, Wimbledon was always the standard setter. And this is because it became part of the London season. And when I say season, I basically mean the season of the aristocracy and royalty moving around the country during the summer. The Eton Harrow sort of varsity matches, the boat race, Epsom Derby, those kinds of things. Wimbledon became very quickly part of that season. And so they can mix socially, parade their daughters, and be seen. And Tom Todd wrote this description. A ticket for the covered seat stand on centre court, no queuing with the general public, of course, and strawberries and cream, if possible, in the members' enclosure. Followed by a stroll around the grounds, all offered the perfect setting for ladies dressed in the height of fashion, who were naturally accompanied by gentlemen correctly attired to meet friends and engage in light conversation. No mention of watching the tennis, because that wasn't important. It was about being seen and the social occasion. Now, other clubs were obviously keen to emulate Wimbledon in terms of their prestige. And really, of course, tennis was secondary to the social occasion. Now, we could characterize this as really amateur ideals, or really southern amateur ideals, rooted in the public schools. And this set of upper-class norms, values, and ideals and practices related to gentlemanly amateurism, as you say, have often been characterized as southern in other sports too, noting the hegemonic southern public school sporting ethos spreading across Britain through clubs, universities, and associations run by often ex-public school boys. And this also reflects the dominance of the southeast in terms of lawn tennis culture, especially Wimbledon. So really, we get the sense that the southern ideals were hegemonic. They were the ones that were sort of considered to be the most prevalent across Britain at this time. So really, this kind of gave me the question, is there any evidence, therefore, of a north-south divide in lawn tennis? And what might this north-south divide look like? So looking at other sports, we see this north-south divide discussed in a fair amount of detail. In cricket, for example, crudely, the idea of a north-south divide is characterized by this. The north is considered to be more open, accessible. The south is more elitist. The north more competitive, professional-minded. The south more conservative and amateur-oriented. The north fans more enthusiastic and expressive, emotional. The south fans more reserved, possibly related to Lord's cricket being part of the London season again. We're not related to cricket. Though, Duncan Stone's written excellent research that suggests the perceptions of a north-south divide are exaggerated. And he wrote, neither regional ideology accurately reflected the cricket it allegedly represented, and yet the hegemonic nature of the amateur ethos remains in the minds of southern supporters today, despite semi-professional leagues being played in the south for over 40 years. And in this paper, he was looking at the differences between Yorkshire and Surrey cricket identities. Equally, in rugby, we see the ideas of the north-south divide, and Dunning and Sheard and Barbarian sentiment players talked about this. The qualitatively different attitudes towards how and by whom rugby should be played, which of course led to the Great Split in 1895 and the formation of Rugby League. However, Collins excellently critiqued this idea as being exaggerated. He said, Northern administrators shared their southern neighbours' amateur philosophies and were determined fighters against professionals. So the Northerners were in the same boat as the Southerners, really, but accepted broken time payments out of expediency. And this represents the scale of working class involvement in the North being greater than the South. So for Collins, the North-South divide was less about geographical and regional rivalry and more about the split within Northern administration and the shifting class composition of players towards greater working class involvement. So in tennis, what North-South differences are apparent? Well, I've picked three that are not apparent, judging from the research I've conducted today. The first is the idea of lawn tennis as being socially aspirational. There's evidence to suggest that in both the North and the South, crudely, we see this in evidence. Elitism, social exclusivity, and also support for the amateur ethos. So looking at the first one, this idea of lawn tennis as a social aspiration. I've already talked about this idea of clubs, counties, and regions asserting themselves off-court in terms of royal patronage and prestige, the lavishness of their tournaments, and the opulence of their clubs. Northern clubs were just as interested. I haven't seen any real differences looking at a fair amount of different clubs and descriptions. In these distinctions, the Northern LTC, which is a club based in Manchester, used to play the Northern LTC, played the Northern Championships alternately between Liverpool and Manchester, referred to itself, they self-labeled themselves as the Wimbledon of the North. Now, of course, to call themselves that suggested that they wanted to emulate Wimbledon. And they were a leading club. They hosted the All England Mixed Doubles Championships until 1913. And the Northern, they called them, in past time, it was written in 1885, the Northern Club in Manchester was considered to be one of the three great meetings of the year, typically attracting top players and large attendances, the other being Wimbledon and the Fitzwilliam, the Irish Championships. And clubs across Britain used magazines and newspapers to boast about their facilities. They didn't really talk much about the level of playing standards, more about the facilities and what went on. And Victoria Lawn Tennis Club in Liverpool boasted, apparently in past times, since 1892, a commodious clubhouse containing its ladies' room, smoking and reading rooms, a billiard room with 2 tables, and the usual dressing and bathrooms, and a large concert room and conservatory. This is a description of their tournament, and this is way before they even mentioned who won or lost or who even played. So their tournaments, I shouldn't really be drinking that. Force of habit. it's quite clear that again, the social occasion and the festivities were bound up with the ideas of performance, really. We also get the sense that social exclusivity and elitism were just as rife in the north as they were in the south. Bowdoin LTC, for example, denied children to play on grass courts, which is a fairly typical across courts in the UK. And regarding the possibility of opening up access for women's tennis in Sheffield, a correspondent in the Sheffield and Rotherham Independent in 1892 said the philanthropically disposed might, with immense advantage to the English race, make an effort to place facilities for its indulgence within the reach of every class. So suggesting that there's a possibility that if you wanted to be philanthropic, this would be a good way of doing it. But he didn't actually advocate this, the removal of membership restrictions or the provision of public courts. Chapel Allerton Lawn Tennis and Squash Club in Leeds described its own reputation as being snobbishness. And the Northern at the same sort of time was also criticised for not doing enough to encourage children. So this idea of elitism really continued to prevail. And I don't get a sense that there are major differences between the North and the South here. But again, more research might prove the opposite. Again, this idea of supporting the amateur ethos. Amateurism was not really an issue before the First World War. I mean, the LTA, for the longest time, denied that there was any professionalism in lawn tennis, and it wasn't really until the interwar period when Susan Longland turned pro, and then we had Fred Perry, that these issues emerged, and the professional issues, the professional tournaments were created. Now, there was a thing as pot hunting, this idea of players basically traveling around clubs and tournaments and just all their efforts are played in just winning matches and then converting the prize winnings or the prize trophies, selling them for food, this kind of thing. So there was sort of veiled professionalism, but it was nothing like was experienced in pedestrianism or cricket or other sports like that. So we noticed at this time little differences between the North-South attitudes towards amateurs and professionalism in lawn tennis. Now, in 1924, the LTA instituted its first amateur versus professional match at Queen's Club. Queen's Club was really the hub of professional coaching. Now, again, not ex-amateurs turning pro, but these are coaching professionals who their job is to obviously teach and coach and train. They also arranged 5 further matches, 2 in the North, Leeds and Manchester. So again, a fairly comprehensive spread of this kind of professionalism. No real sense that the North or South was for professional, which is different from, I guess, rugby and cricket. And actually, the push for greater opportunities for coaching professionals came from the Queen's Club, which of course is based in London. And Dan Maskell was really at the forefront. He was born in Fulham. So this idea of southernness being more about amateurism, really in tennis, didn't really emerge until Fred Perry came on. But I'll talk about that later on. So this idea of North-South differences. Well, in these other key areas, I feel that there are some North-South differences that are much clearer in terms of the formation of associations, control, competition, and accessibility. Now, when we look at how tennis developed, lawn tennis developed, it really wasn't a comprehensive spread. It was certain pockets, one of which was the North-West. And Northern associations took a more active interest in forming associations. That is a clear difference we saw. So Lancashire followed Yorkshire in forming a county LTA in 1884. These are the first 2 county lawn tennis associations. For the purpose of promoting inter-county and other first-class matches and of holding an annual or biannual county tournament to be restricted to members of affiliated clubs. Now, exactly why Northern associations felt the need to come together and form associations first is interesting. I'm interested to find out why that is the case. Northumberland and Durham were the next 2. So the North really was at the forefront of creating associations. Now, don't forget, the LTA didn't form until 1888. So these associations were already in existence, and some in Scotland as well, before the national LTA formed in London. Now, before this happened, the All England Club were in control, similar to the position of the MCC in cricket. They basically created the rules and the structures involved. And other leading clubs at this time resented the Wimbledon's control, the club's control, on All England men's and doubles singles and men's doubles events. And a lot of resistance came from Northern clubs, who resented the Southeast administrative and control of lawn tennis. After all, the Northern associations formed first. And early meetings of leading clubs, this is before the association was created, for example, in 1883, only 3 of 12 were actually from the North. And there was a movement around the late 1890s, early 1900s of actually removing the All England Championships from Wimbledon and actually rotating it around a number of different clubs. The Northern and Buxton were two. And I'll read this section from Lawn Tennis in 1900. As spectator interest in the capital dipped in the mid-1890s, it was suggested, if the people in the suburbs around London do not care to see good lawn tennis, why not hold the championships, at least occasionally, where the public have some appreciation of the skills and difficulties in the game? In 1901, Wimbledon was said to have fallen below Edgbaston, Buxton, Eastbourne, Newcastle, and Brighton tournaments in terms of crowds, entries, and local interest. This is one part of the history of Wimbledon that they don't tell you. The fact that it almost didn't sustain itself. Competition as well. We get the sense that in the north there were some differences. A description of from Lawn Tennis magazine in 1900 says, sandwich men paraded the streets, the papers advertised the day's matches, the railway companies run dozens of extra trains, and the people flocked to the matches in thousands. It's a very different story around London. In the south, they were described as having smaller crowds, fewer entries, they were less enthusiastic in terms of local interest. And a visitor to Wimbledon in 1903 recalled, never have I seen anything like the apathy of that crowd round the centre court. Half of them were watching another match, and the other half were languidly chatting for all the world as if they were in a concert room while an indifferent pianist was performing. Again, the sense that in the north, competition is perhaps more serious, in the south, more about the social occasion. In terms of competition, structured competition, Sheffield and District obviously instituted the first men's and women's interclub league in 1891. And when the LTA created a national interclub knockout competition, Yorkshire and Lancashire were the only two northern counties represented, the largest of course, but also the only. Though their participation was not always encouraged. In the Sheffield and Rotherham Independent, a correspondent wrote, I don't consider it at all a matter for congratulation that our leading Sheffield club has allowed itself to be drawn into the ring, referring to the elite Hallamshire club. And Duncan Stone's paper on the regional identity of an amateurism in cricket, I think, might give some insight here. The MCC is a bastion of upper middle class amateurism, considered competition in the form of leagues and tournaments as the thin end of the wedge of vulgar, competitive, and professional northern cricket. And I consider that a similar form of amateur aversion towards competition was likely evident in tennis, given the similar class backgrounds of officials. So that's a sense that I get from looking at the research. Now, such was the level of northern enthusiasm that the LTA were persuaded in 1893 to move the finals away from London. And unfortunately, at that point, then all the London clubs decided not to participate. So you get the sense that competition was firmly rooted in northern tennis, perhaps not the same as in southern tennis. Accessibility, again, is another issue that you see differences. Parks tennis, of course, was very popular in the north and less so in the south. Manchester introduced the first Parks LTA, Parks Lawn Tennis Association, in 1909. They were the first by a landslide, but they were followed by a number of other cities, all of them northern: Sheffield, Birkenhead, Liverpool, Derby, St Helens, Sunderland, and Scarborough. London, Cardiff, and Birmingham built public courts, but they did not create their own associations. So not only do you see more enthusiasm for park tennis, which again is more about the lower middle classes, working classes participating, but also are less keen to create associations. Men's and women's interclub leagues were instituted with coaching opportunities added in 1920 for the industrial and artisan classes. So again, we get a sense that the northern associations were much keen to broaden the infrastructure and the clientele playing tennis. Works tennis as well, we see some interesting differences. Joyce Kay wrote about works tennis clubs, which were particularly strong in the North and Midlands. Labour Brothers, Port Sunlight Works in Cheshire, and of course the Kellam and Welbeck factories in Nottinghamshire are two examples. Again, talent development, something else that's interesting. School interclub competitions were held for boys and girls in the 1880s, and again, the North was championing this kind of cause. The first known tournaments were held in the North, in Yorkshire in 1895 and in Lancashire in 1902 for boys and girls respectively. And when they were held in the South, there was less enthusiasm. One example, Ventnor organised an under-17 tournament in 1903, only 3 entries. So you go home to your mum, hey mum, guess what? I made the semi-finals. Or one kid would have made it to the final without even playing. Wonderful. That would have helped his county ranking. So you get the sense that, and again, northern tennis for juniors was much more popular. So again, opening up this analysis of the north-south divide, I feel that the evidence isn't really clear. I mean, I'm still working on this. It's a work in progress. But from what I see, some areas there's a north-south divide, but it's not comprehensive, so you couldn't make that conclusion. So evidence is not found for a clear north-south divide, similar to that perhaps perceived in cricket and rugby. And some further questions, given the regionality of lawn tennis development, how would you identify it? And if differences existed, could they be divorced from criteria related to social class? So differences did exist in key areas. So a sort of summary, I haven't finished, but a summary really of what I found. Lawn tennis in the north, seemingly more enthusiastic, keen to develop talent, particularly among girls, and also to stimulate competition. And the presence of a stronger industrial bourgeoisie, willing to patronize tennis in parks and works associations were part of that. They were keener to form associations. Now, I'm not entirely sure of why this might be. Maybe it's an indication of enhanced seriousness, or it could be the perceived need for the upper middle classes officials to more strictly control lawn tennis and ensure it develops alongside, in accordance with their interests. Perhaps they were less status secure in the north, and so thought if they form associations, they can retain control in a very organized way. In the south, we get the sense that administrators are more secure with establishing elitist clubs and associations. There's better support, less resistance. And again, also partly a reflection of Wimbledon being part of the London season, and we had the support from London-based aristocracy within that. So, going back to this idea of an analysis of the north-south divide. Over time, now we're moving into the interwar period now, over time, Southern administrative hegemony was sustained. And the Lawn Tennis Association and the All England Lawn Tennis Club Committee were educated in public school amateur ethos. Now the first sign I mentioned, it was actually probably the second sign. The first sign was actually Susan Longland signing a professional contract with Cash and Carry Pilot, his name was, and playing abroad. But really when Fred Perry, the British champion at Wimbledon in the 1930s, when he became a professional, it really signaled this issue in the minds of the LTA. And I have some very interesting quotes from Fred Perry. Some of you might have heard of these. Some of them are quite famous. Perry wrote in his autobiography from 1984, "The Wimbledon crowds had never seen an Englishman of this era who didn't like to lose. You have to try to impose your superiority on him as forcefully as you can. Give him a beating to remember. Well, I don't think this was an approach generally favored in England at the time." And in an anecdote of when he first won his first Wimbledon championship in 1933, he's talking about being in a dressing room with the guy he beat, Jack Crawford from Australia. Out in the dressing room, I overheard the distinctive voice of Braham Hilliard, club committee man, talking to Crawford. "Congratulations," said Hilliard. "This was one day when the best man didn't win." He was in a shower. He was having a shower at the time. "I couldn't believe my ears. Hilliard had brought a bottle of champagne into the dressing room and given it to Jack. There, draped over the back of my seat, was the official acknowledgement of my championship, an honorary All-England Club member's tie. Instead of Fred J. Perry, the champ, I felt like Fred J. Muggs, the chimp." And I believe this was sort of really possibly reflected more in more of a working class attitude. Now, I don't think Fred Perry was working class. I mean, I know his father was a Labour MP, but he had a fairly, I'd say more of a lower middle class upbringing. But he was ultra competitive, took very seriously, trained, he hated losing, and used gamesmanship in his play, which is very much a sort of working class attitude. And just before he died in February 1995, he was interviewed by an American journalist called Elliot Berry. And he put his social position at the time in the context of regional differences. So this is where he sort of talks about the north-south divide. "My father was a Labour MP. He was a union man in the cotton trade, and the first Labour governments of the late 20s and early 30s were always minority governments, and Labour was a very dirty word. Plus, I was North Country, from Stockport in Cheshire, well by 120 yards, really, from Lancashire, and the North Country people never understood the Southerners. They didn't understand me, I didn't understand them, and I never tried. See, I was in a game at the time which was very establishment, very top draw. Most of the players and most of the officials were all high society, Oxford, Cambridge boys, and I wasn't. But unfortunately," he winked, "I got good enough to beat them all." This is him just before he died, probably in his 80s. So the myth of the north-south divide, I think, was actually exaggerated as a way of sort of creating more regional identities as an outcome of poor LTA management and administrative bias. There's evidence to suggest the LTA were very Southern-centric in their management of tennis growth, particularly in terms of the bias towards Southern clubs and associations and the bias towards juniors when they select teams to compete. In the post-war period, Dan Maskell and Fred Perry organized an LTA nationwide tour called Focus on Tennis. And this is a nationwide tour, apparently. But only 2 of the towns visited, 2 of the 14 towns, were in the north. And then when they took the best of those players from this nationwide training camp, only 4 who were invited to the winter training school in South Dean were northern-based. And then they decided they called this a nationwide thing. So there were a number of anecdotal pieces of evidence to support these ideas of northern bias. This is Alan Mills. He was for a very long time referee of Wimbledon and a very fairly high-status individual. Here he is receiving an award. He wrote in his autobiography from 2005, in an anecdote he claimed was nothing extraordinary at the time and par for the course. As a 15-year-old, around 1950, standing on a platform, tennis gear in tow, waiting to board a train, heading for South Dean's LTA training camp. Standing right next to the LTA chairman, Mills recalled, "It could not have been more obvious that I was heading to the same destination as him, but he completely ignored me before getting into a first-class carriage. I was in third class. After disembarking, and without so much as a 'hello, young laddie, see you at the camp,' he breezed straight past me, climbed into a taxi, while I bumbled off in search of the bus stop." And this experience for Mills, who is a future British Davis Cup player, taught him what he called the LTA attitude, which came to mean the association's tendency to look down upon the very players they claimed publicly to be supporting. Moreover, being from Lancashire, Mills always felt that there was some real substance to the talk of a north-south divide, in his words. And he claimed, if you came from the north, it was certainly more difficult to catch the eye of the national selectors. We also see a lack of attention to northern tennis, according to the Park LTAs of the 1950s. And Dan Maskell reflected on the LTA's attitude at this time. He said, "It was quite apparent that people felt the LTA were not terribly concerned with the development of the game in the 1950s. Park superintendents felt they were being neglected, and of course most park superintendents were in the north. Some schools felt much the same, and all too often some of the counties were not really trying to spread the game to a new generation of players." And so what happened was, within a few years, a new association called the British Parks Amateur Lawn Tennis Association, formed in 1957 by a conglomeration of just Northern Park LTAs. So the Northern Park LTAs formed 5 initial members: Sheffield, Manchester, Leeds, Bradford, and Birmingham. And according to a lawn tennis and badminton report from 1958, just after it formed, there was a general expressed feeling in the north that more could be done for the players, the clubs, and the associations which pursued the game on the park courts. It was thought that a nationally organised tournament might stimulate interest in parks tennis, particularly among juniors. And within a year, the association grew to also include Dumfries, Glasgow, Nelson, a club in Lancashire, Fenton Club in Staffordshire, and Walsall, all northern, with only Bournemouth and Brighton and Hove the only southern representatives. Now, ironically, southern expansion was limited because of lack of funds to facilitate inter-park matches. And within 5 years, the BPA LTA folded and was taken over by the Lawn Tennis Federation, essentially a charity branch of the Lawn Tennis Association, which had as its aim to bring death to the old tradition of tennis being perceived as a snob sport. So they really did talk about this idea of class within that, but again, always rooted in northern-southern distinctions. So, to some long-winded concluding points. Rather than comprehensively across Britain, lawn tennis developed in key pockets, one of which was the northwest. And Lancashire was a real starting point for lawn tennis. Now, particularly championing parks tennis and enthusiastic, particularly among girls' lawn tennis as well, talent development programs. And again, asking sort of why it wasn't more comprehensive, well, I would say that the lack of a comprehensive geographical spread was likely due to the fact that tennis was not being played in boys' public schools until the 1920s. So the sort of southern public school expansion, which then allowed a lot of these players to spread across Britain, didn't happen. Also, lawn tennis was not a team sport, so we're not proper team sport, so it wasn't invested with the same social significance as cricket and rugby in communities. So not only was this related to perhaps why public schools didn't want tennis within that, but also within communities, there just wasn't that wholesale sort of connection with that. So really, lawn tennis remained a minority middle-class sport, really until the interwar period, unlike rugby, union, and cricket. And really, from my perspective, any talk of a distinctive north-south divide in tennis, and there might be one. I mean, I'm still looking at it. We're still looking at evidence. But I think that to a large extent, a lot of it is exaggerated. Any talk of this north-south divide tends to be built on anecdotal rather than factual evidence. Ignores the nuances within tennis clubs, tournaments, and associations in all regions. So it ignores things like the exclusivity found in northern clubs and the southern clubs, who are very, very much proponents of professionalism. It also downplays the role of class conflict within the north-south clubs and associations. So essentially within these clubs, which I think underpinned attitudes towards amateurism and professionalism, competitive values, and playing attitudes and styles. And also considerations of talent development and views on accessibility and social exclusion. And my final point is any talk of a distinctive north-south divide in tennis that remains today, for me, underlines the continued importance of regional identities in Britain and in tennis. And I think that's it. So thanks.
You can have the fizzy now, yeah. Okay. Nice one, Rob, thank you very much. Okay. Ray first, then Malcolm.
I'll make one comment and then one question.
Sure.
Okay. First, I think what you're saying is parallel exactly in golf. You get different clubs in the same town, getting in the same groups. It's exclusive, even in the north. But the divided in golf is a national one. It's England versus Scotland, which always claimed it was democratic golf and had much more participation. My question is, have you looked at what the Miners' Welfare Fund did? That was started after the First World War.
Right.
Money was made from royalties on each ton of gold produced, and it went into a Miners' Welfare Fund.
I'll write this down.
Yeah. Which was spent by a joint committee of mine owner representatives and the mine unions. And they built tennis courts as part of their spending pattern. And this is from 1921-22.
Right, yeah.
So that and of course the mines are not in southern England.
No, of course, yeah.
They might reflect back the north-south divide.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Malcolm.
Thanks, Rob. Really enjoyed that. The little story about the national talent search that took it to up to the north, brought to my ZZ Top, was their world tour that was 54 days in Texas and one in New York City. But my question is that I'm kind of convinced by your argument, because it resonates with what we know in cricket and rugby.
Yeah.
That there are administrative distinctions, but there are enormous, as Ray was saying, class distinctions in the north as much as there are in the south. What about, in the case of tennis, what about Scotland and Wales? But you've talked about England here.
Yeah.
But what about across those two borders into the other parts of Britain?
With specific reference to amateurism or just generally?
Oh, to this sense of
a divide.
Of regional distinctiveness.
It's a good question. Edinburgh University was one of a handful of universities alongside Cambridge and Oxford that was awarded immediate representation on the LTA Council. So you get the sense that, again, among the upper middle class, it was certainly they were certainly inclusive in Scotland. Scotland also had different climatic conditions, and so they didn't have grass courts, and that was influential. They had a lot of indoor courts, so that was influential in terms of status and prestige. We know that they formed associations earlier than they did in the LTA. I mean, shortly after Durham and Northumbria and Lancashire and Yorkshire, they had a number of associations form in Scotland. So we know Scotland was perhaps similar in that respect, in terms of quite progressive with forming associations. Wales is a very interesting situation because, by all accounts, tennis wasn't particularly widely, comprehensively played across Wales. There are certain clubs, Craigside and Llandudno, which was very progressive in terms of coaching. I didn't get the sense that there was any kind of divide. It was just another region of Britain where tennis wasn't there wasn't a pocket of except for Craigside. I mean, and that's all I can really say. I mean, there's a huge absence of any information on tennis in Wales, except for local histories from clubs themselves. But I was. Thanks.
Simon, then Bob.
Cheers, Robert. It's very interesting to talk to last few days about podcast. I'm just wondering on your Mascombe Perry tour, and the two clubs out of the 14 in the north.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you elaborate on that, or who was it that made these decisions? Who selects them? Because I presume the LTA was involved in some way, but also Emlyn Jones was also with Mascombe for at least 3 years.
Yep.
With Mascombe Perry on that tour, and he was representative of the CCPR. So I'm just wondering how was there kind of like some sort of committee that was formed to decide on this, or how did it?
Well, it was an LTA. It was an LTA sanctioned roadshow essentially, where they were going to go into all these clubs, 14 clubs basically. You know, make a big song and dance, and then if they saw any decent players, they'd pick them and say, "Come to the LTA training school in South Dean." And they picked a handful and they went down. I don't know who was in charge in terms of selecting which clubs. I don't know if it was a matter of invitation. I don't know if it was a matter of clubs offering their services to have that come in. I believe it was the Northern and Scarborough who were the two clubs. And again, two of the leading clubs in the North at the time anyway. So I don't actually know those details. It's something that I'd love to look into. You know, who's making those decisions in terms of where this is going, and who's actually the selectors. But because I get the sense that it's the LTA. It's the LTA, not the county LTAs, but the LTA in the headquarters in London.
And interesting to involve the CCPR as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bob?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
This is a classic sort of media historian's question, but I guess I was just fascinated in the media culture that surrounds tennis, particularly in its Victorian and Edwardian period. Because I look at a lot of historical newspapers. I've never looked for tennis, but I'm sort of conscious that it wasn't being reported, at least as far as I can see, anything like as much as football, cricket, and some of those other sports.
Yeah.
So yeah, how does it sort of media coverage compare? What kind of impact did it have in that wider kind of media culture at the time?
It's a good question. I did a lot of my research looking at tennis-specific magazines, which of course were writing lots about tennis.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I mean, tennis was a fairly southern sport. In terms of Wimbledon coverage, you get the sense, very much like same today. During Wimbledon, widely reported in the Times, and again in those types of newspapers. In terms of regional papers, again, they would talk about certain clubs and associations in the north or elsewhere around the country that would take part. But again, it was a fairly marginal sport, certainly at least until the interwar period. So, and that was reflected in a sort of lack of widespread correspondence. You had to specifically look for tennis. You couldn't open up a back page of a newspaper and automatically find something on tennis like you would on football or cricket or rugby. But occasionally there would be articles and there would be things in there that would come out. But until the 1920s, it wasn't widespread, really.
Any more? Right.
A very minor statistical point. If 2 clubs out of 14 were Northern and 4 out of 21 players were Northern, they're overrepresented.
Thanks for that.
Just wondered, can I ask?
Yeah, of course.
Since Carol's here, why don't you tell us something about the handle, or the companion that you got?
Sorry, what?
The tennis companion, whatever it's called.
You want me to market the book I'm about to write?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
All right. So, Carol, Stephen Wagg, and I approached Routledge to write a handbook. It's called the Routledge Handbook of Tennis, History, Culture and Politics. 40-odd chapters ranging history, culture and politics of tennis. Writers all across the world. And that's due to be released probably in about 18 months. That's all I'll say on that.
That's soon. That's soon.
Well, maybe not. Yeah, we're very exciting.
Okay, so you'll be able to buy that after having read Rob's current book,
Which is the winner of the BSSH.
which has won the BSSH Aberdeen Prize this year.
Last year, and Rob will be giving out Aberdeen lecture.
You will.
Thank you. Helps that I know the people who are judging. I'll buy you a drink now. Talk about it.
You get a free one next door if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.